We're ready for you to begin.
Okay. Welcome everybody to today's LightTalks. I really want to thank Rabbi Moshe Wilhelm, the Executive Director of Chabad of Oregon, for producing this amazing program, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland for supporting it. LightTalks happen several times a year. It's usually in conjunction with major significant dates on the Jewish calendar. So please look out. I think the next program is going to be happening late summer. Today's LightTalks focuses on how Purim and Pesach can shine light on your life. With all that's going on in the world right now and in our own personal lives, this is something that all of us are very eager to hear from our esteemed rabbis. And I, for one, am really looking forward to hearing from Rabbi Greenberg and from Rabbi Lipskar. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Rabbi Dov Greenberg is the founder and executive director of the Chabad House at Stanford University. It's known for its cutting-edge programming and operations. The L'chaim Club is one of the most vibrant, thriving student societies at Stanford. It attracts high-level speakers, high-profile speakers from across the world of art, politics, culture, and Israel advocacy. Rabbi Greenberg is a unique thought leader in the Jewish world, much sought-after lecturer. He has lectured in North America, Israel, Europe. Please welcome Rabbi Dov Greenberg. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Rebbitzin, do you want to give me a thumbs up just so I know that the voice is coming out? Okay, we're good. So a child comes home from school and he sees his father is holding his report card, and his report card is filled with F's, and he sees that his father's outraged, really upset. So he looks at his father with innocence, a big smile, and he says, "Dad, what do you think the trouble with me is? Do you think it's hereditary or environment?" So we live in a time where there's a lot of difficulty in our environments, in the world at large, and people have internal struggles. There's struggles that each of us deal with. And to this world of struggle, both inside and outside, Judaism has some profound things to say about how to deal with it. So I want to focus on an interesting insight that in a way captures a mission statement of Judaism, but also could give us hope and happiness in challenging times. And that is, I'll do with a preface. You have in literature, you have a technique that some writers use, especially some of the greatest writers, that when they introduce a character into their novel, the first words they put into the character's mouth, in other words, the first words the character speaks, tells us about the essence of the character, about what the character is about. So for example, in a book that many are familiar with, so let's say, look at Shakespeare. Shakespeare does this a lot. The Merchant of Venice, famous amongst Jewish people, not maybe for, we don't come out looking so good in the book, but Shylock, the Jewish moneylender, when Shakespeare introduces him into his book, what are the first words Shylock says? The first words out of his mouth is, he says, 3,000 golden ducats, with an exclamation mark. Those are his first words. What Shakespeare is doing, he's telegraphing that this guy's obsessed with money. That's who this guy, that's what he's concerned with. So his first words really encapsulate who he is, what he's about. In Macbeth, he does a similar thing with Lady Macbeth, who was the vicious wife of the king. The first words out of her mouth is, she's talking to her husband. She's trying to get her husband to kill somebody. And she says, "I fear the milk of your kindness in your character." So she's a cold personality. Throughout the book, she's vicious. Again, the first words out of her mouth is she has fear of somebody's kindness. And they do that in film, and many authors do it. But that's all the Shakespeare we learned in yeshiva. So those were the two examples. But what's interesting is let's apply this idea to the book of all books, the Torah, the Bible. Who's the main character in the Bible? The main character in the Bible is who? Is God. He's the main character. So an interesting question is, what are God's first words in the Torah? What are the first words God says? He actually says in the creation process. And the words are, I'll say them in Hebrew, the two words, Yehi or, let there be light. In English, it's more than two words. Light be. But the normal translation, Yehi or, let there be light. And in a sense, that tells us everything we need to know about God and Judaism and the Jewish mission. The task of the Torah and the Jew is to bring Yehi or, to bring light into the world, into our environment, into our hearts, the light of ethics, the light of morality, the light of kedusha, of holiness, the light of mitzvah, the light of generosity. So to be a Jew is to bring light, to kindle lights in our hearts, in our environment, and in the world entire. It's a big responsibility. It's a big task. In fact, there's a beautiful piece of Talmud. Listen to this Talmud. The Talmud says that before a child is born, before a child comes into the world, so it says an angel teaches the child in the mother's womb spiritual teachings, deep teachings, Torah teachings. And the Talmud says a candle, a light, is illuminated over the child, al-Reishay. And from this light, the Talmud says, the child could see misof ha'olam va'ad sofo, from one end of the world to the other, this light in the womb. That's the image of the Talmud. But isn't that a beautiful teaching? What the Talmud is saying is that even before a child comes into the world, they are already being taught that their mission is to bring light, misof ha'olam va'ad sofo. That our mission is, before we even get into the world, is to know that we have a responsibility to kindle those lights of goodness, of compassion in our communities, and by extension to the world. It's a powerful mission statement. So that's what it is to bring light. So the question is, how do we bring light? How do we bring light in the most successful, happy way? So to this, I want to turn to a charming Hasidic story that's deceptively simple, but very powerful. The story is that there was a fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe. His name was the Rebbe Rashab. That's what he was called, Rebbe Rashab. And he once had a visitor, a chassid from a famous Hasidic city from Kremenchuk. It was a city that had many Jewish institutions and a lot of the Chabad community. That was then in Russia, Ukraine. The borders always move there. But be that as it may, this chassid traveled a long distance. He came to where the Rebbe Rashab was at the time. Now, the Rebbe Rashab knew that this chassid, this disciple, lived in Kremenchuk. And he had a lot of community and students there, etc., institutions. So he tells the chassid, he asks the chassid. The chassid came and had an audience with him, a private discussion. He begins by asking him, he says, "Was Herzach in Kremenchuk? What's happening? How are things over there in Kremenchuk? Tell me about the community." He wanted a report, an update. So the chassid says, in Kremenchuk, things are unbelievable. It's really special there. This is the schools, the educational system, beautiful. People are learning Torah in a really beautiful way. He says the houses of community kindness, of tzedakah, of chesed, the centers that do acts of kindness and grace for community, for people on the margins, tremendous charity, tremendous generosity. The city is filled with kindness. He says you go to the synagogues, very special prayer. People are really meditating, praying, connecting to God. It's very, very special. So if you want to know what's happening in Kremenchuk, it's just an extraordinary place, paradise. So the Rebbe Rashab was overjoyed, very happy, and he gave this chassid a golden ruble, which was a significant sum. He says, "Thank you for the good news." Fine. And they had the conversation. It went on. A few hours later, another visitor from Kremenchuk came, another chassid, another disciple of the Rebbe Rashab. So he comes in. Rebbe Rashab says, "Oh, you're from Kremenchuk. Was Herzach in Kremenchuk? What's happening? How are things unfolding in Kremenchuk?" So the Chassid does in Kremenchuk, it's terrible, disaster. He says the schools, they don't really learn. It's shallow. It's not sophisticated, real study. They don't study in depth for change. It's superficial. It's not the prayer. If you go into the synagogues, prayer and that's mediocre. It's people that pray robotically. It's not really from the heart. It's not elevating people. And generosity, it's a town of narcissists. The city is filled with narcissistic ego people. Some people give charity, but it's just about their honor. And people are really selfish. And so it's a disaster. It's not. So the Rebbe Rashab said, I thank you very much for the report. Thank you. And then they went on. Now, he didn't give this fellow the golden coin. Fine. A few hours later, it's late at night, these two respective Hasidim, two disciples, they encounter each other. And they both give a report about their conversation they had earlier that day with the Rebbe. Now, suddenly, the Chassid who gave the negative report hears that his colleague gave this beautiful report and got a golden coin. He's outraged. So he runs back to the Rebbe, he knocks on the door, the Rebbe lets him in. He says, this is a miscarriage of justice. This is not fair. He says, Rebbe, what are you talking about? He says, the first Chassid came and he gave you this report about Kremenchuk and he told you everything was beautiful. Jewishness, study, mitzvah, Torah, kindness, beautiful. You gave him a gold coin, but he exaggerated. He sold you a bill of goods. He didn't give you a real report. You were there. That was his perspective. I gave you the real report. You asked me what was going on. I really told you what was going on. And I certainly deserve a gold coin. Why did you give me a gold coin? Just because I gave you a correct report? So the Rebbe looked at him with a glint in his eye, a smile. The Rebbe said like this. He tells him, listen closely to this. The Rebbe says, do you think I don't know what's going on in Kremenchuk? I know very, very well what's going on in Kremenchuk. I just wanted to see in which Kremenchuk do you live? In which Kremenchuk do you live? That's why I asked the question. Powerful idea. We can come into an environment, we can look at our home, our community, the world. And a big question is, are we kindling light in our mind and in our heart with a positive perspective? So that when we view our Kremenchuk, our home, our relationships, who we are as people, and the world we live in, the light we bring from within then illuminates from it out. So that's the first question. If we have a responsibility, if you can define Jewishness with those first words that God said, let us create light in the world at all levels. So the first thing we need to know is it's not about the environment or my spouse or my child or the school or the government or Trump, whatever, everybody could have problems. That's not the issue. The issue is in what Kremenchuk do we choose to live? Are we kindling the light of godliness on our heart, of goodness, of generosity? Are we focusing on the good things we have, our godly soul, our neshama? It's powerful. We all have a soul, a neshama. We all do many powerful mitzvahs and acts of goodness. Those are bright spots. Those are pieces of light in our hearts. So if we look at those and we focus on becoming the kind of people that live in a space of light, then the world we look at becomes a place of light. We're instruments in kindling those lights. Now look how beautifully this is expressed at the Seder table. We're about to celebrate Passover, and the Passover experience is beautiful. The Haggadah is a very powerful, it's a small pamphlet, but it contains a great deal. There was a thinker, a writer, his name was Eric Hoffer. He one time said that a thick book covers up what the author doesn't know. The thin book reveals what the author does know. The Haggadah tells us some deep things about what Judaism does know. It's short, but it's very powerful. So we'll look for a moment, just at the opening words of the Haggadah. They seem simple, but there's a profound message. It gets to the issue that we're discussing light, the Jewish approach to bringing light into the world, even in challenging times. The Haggadah begins, the Magid, the main narrative section, when we tell the story of the Exodus, it begins with these words. Holach ma'anya achala avisana. This is the bread of affliction our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. This is the bread of affliction. Whoever is hungry, come in and join with us. Come celebrate Pesach with us. That's the opening word. This is the bread of affliction. Whoever's hungry. It's a very strange way to begin. Offering bread of affliction to people. Next time you have a guest, try that. Here's some dinner of affliction. Or offering bread of affliction to the guests that come in. What is that about? The opening line. So the idea is this. The Jewish people had been in Egypt for over 200 years, tremendous suffering, agony, real pain and suffering, real victims. So the Jewish people knew what it felt like, what it felt like to be whipped and abused, very harsh conditions. So now we begin to celebrate the night of freedom from that experience, from slavery to freedom, from darkness to light. So the question is, how does a human being do that, nationally or individually? The answer is that the Jews could have left Egypt and said, because we suffered, because we experienced pain, we are going to perpetuate that. We're going to live bitter, an angry kind of life because so much injustice happened to us. That happens a lot if you speak to therapists. A lot of people that actually, unfortunately, abuse children, etc. They themselves had that experience. Very common. But what the Torah, the Jewish tradition, calls on the Jewish people the night of Seder, the night when we celebrate our freedom, is the exact opposite. We acknowledge the pain and suffering. This is the bread of affliction. We suffered, no question. But what do we do with what went wrong in our life? What do we do with our suffering? We say, this is the bread of affliction. We suffered, and I know what it feels like to go to bed hungry. I know what it feels like to be lonely because I experienced it. Therefore, whoever is hungry, come into our home because we have love. We have space for you. So Judaism says, don't live a life of anger and bitterness, even if you experienced it, the exact opposite. Take your darkness, your bitterness, and cultivate a sensitivity and a grace to people that need you most. Turn it into a mitzvah, turn it into a candle of light. So we begin to say there, it's not merely an opening line. It's telling us if you want to be a free person, if you want to experience psychological exodus on the night of the Seder, you have to know how to take the negative experiences in your life and turn it into the beautiful charka, into blessings for other people. So that's what it is to be a Jew. To be a Jew is to bring light into the world and also to know, as the Torah commands many times, it says, you were slaves in Egypt, therefore be kind to the marginal, to the stranger, to the oppressed. In other words, transform your experience. And I'm going to conclude with this quick episode, very powerful, it brings it all together. True story, 1909, a woman in Manhattan, Henrietta Zold was her name. She's living in Manhattan. She was in love with this fellow. She was a bit older, and she was seeing this man for many, many years. She thought he was going to propose. That was the plan. Anyways, he dumps her. Runs off with somebody much younger. She was devastated, broken, depressed for a while. She knew she wasn't going to get married after this. But she had a kind heart. She was a loving person. And even though one day she woke up, she said, I'm not going to get married, but I have so much love in my heart. I don't want to become angry. So I need to bring my love and what I feel to the world, even though I'm not going to get married. So she created an institution. What institution? You all know the institution she created from that experience. She created a women's institution, the largest women's organization, Zionist organization, pro-Israel, called Hadassah. She founded Hadassah after that event. Hadassah saved thousands of children during the Holocaust, created some of the greatest medical facilities not only in Israel, in the Middle East. Millions of women have volunteered and done acts of kindness and grace and goodness. Why? Because Henrietta Zold, a Jewish woman in Manhattan, tasted the bread of affliction. Her heart was broken. But she said to be a Jew is to bring light into the world. I'm going to take the frustration and somehow bring life and goodness and mitzvah to other people. And that's what she did. And if you go to her gravesite, she's buried in Israel, in Yerushalayim, in Har HaZeisim, Mount of Olives, and you see her tombstone. Know what it says there? It says Henrietta Zold, her name, when she was born, when she passed away. And underneath it says in big words, Mother of Thousands. Henrietta, Mother of Thousands. She kindled thousands of souls. So that's what it is to be a Jew in these times, to remember that we have a neshama, a godly spark in us. We have the capacity to bring light into the world from one end to the other. The He-Ar is our mission statement every single morning, to wake up and say, How do I do that next mitzvah? How do I bring that light of love and generosity to the person around us? And when we do that, we experience true freedom because we learn to take our negative experiences and cultivate kindness from it so that we turn all bitterness into light and laughter and joy. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Greenberg. I don't even have words. That was so, so powerful. Even more than that, it was very, very empowering. I mean, wow, thank you. There are going to be questions and answers for either of the rabbis at the end of the session and after both rabbis speak. So you can post your questions on the bottom. You'll see there's a question and answer tab. So please send your questions there. Thank you. Our next speaker is a man that needs no introduction, but that's not going to stop me. Rabbi Shalom Dovber Lipskar is Shliach of the Rebbe from Bell Harbor, Florida. He's the founder and head rabbi of the Shul, recognized by Newsweek as one of America's most vibrant congregations. He founded the Aleph Institute, a national Jewish education and humanitarian organization that focuses on the incarcerated, as well as military and their families. He's also the founder of the Chaim Yaakov Shlomo Campus of Jewish Studies. And in 2013, Rabbi Lipskar was listed as one of Jewish 100 by the Allgemeine Journal. It's really with immense pleasure that I welcome Rabbi Lipskar.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers also. I have a long-range relationship with Rabbi Moshe Wilhelm since he visited. He was part of our community's growth here many years ago. We're very fortunate having that kind of leadership there. My topic is talking from your perspective about Purim and Pesach and approaching it. I'd like to broaden it a little bit from some perspective in a very simple recognition that for some reason, the single most attended Jewish meal of the year is the Passover Seder. It is the one meal that most Jews who attend a Jewish meal participate in. It's not synagogue. It's not any kind of cultural matter. It's attending that meal. It goes to such a degree that I'm acquainted with certain circumstances where people will have a Seder together and they will serve a bread at the end of the meal because it's not a religious experience for them at that moment, but somehow it has attracted the attention of more Jews than anywhere else. And the question is, of course, why? What is so special about this holiday? And particularly in its relevance to us today in the 21st century, where the conditions of life are completely different than they were when this holiday first came into being. We are no longer slaves in Egypt, and we don't experience the various extraordinary miracles that experienced at that time, 10 plagues, splitting of the sea, all those factors that were initiated during the Exodus from Egypt. So how does that really comport and impact us today, except for the fact that we kind of are a cultural people and sustain certain cultures that make sense to us, that feels, but this one is so out of the box, you know, you kind of have to eat this unleavened bread because 3,500 years ago, our ancestors came out of Egypt eating unleavened bread, and leavening is not good. It's just the concepts there are a little, you might say, esoteric. And then we drink 4 cups of wine, and the entire procedure of a Seder night also has so many factors to it, so many little customs that seem to be so significant. But in practicality, it's like practicing some kind of a rite in some religion. How does that comport to the intelligence of our existence and what it means for us to be the advanced minds that we are? So what does that really mean, and why is that so powerful? So really, in understanding it, you have to trace a little bit of patterns of Jewishness and history, generally speaking, and think about what gives a person a certain energy to make the kinds of sacrifices that are necessary to sustain that which is important to them. So if you take a look simply from a historical point of view, like coming to America, in order for people to fulfill their dream of what it means to have freedom, at that time, primarily freedom of religion, but freedom to be able to do what you feel is right without being encumbered and told that you cannot do it because someone just out of a whim makes a decision that he doesn't like what you're doing or she doesn't like what you're doing. So they cross a sea. To the people that came to America, the pilgrims, if you read their history, the crossing of their sea was like the splitting of the sea. That's how they felt when they came across that treacherous sea, that they had to navigate their path by the stars and had to come to a new world, start a new life without any kind of preparation that was necessary for that. But it required a mission, a purpose, an objective. It was so strong that they put their lives on the line. And they went out in the most dangerous circumstances just to cross that line to absolute freedom. That's what is necessary. And that it takes place over and over again in every certain aspect of our experience, whether it's a business. The most successful businesses, if you talk to the high-level CEOs and specialists who have created and conduct enormous business success, they will tell you that in order to be successful in business, the best thing is find out what you love doing and do it for a living. That's how continuity persists. Otherwise, as is well known by the novel that's the social kind of study that's been written in every language, short sleeves to short sleeves. If you lose purpose, you eventually lose that which you consider to be the most significant reason for the objective. That's the general process. The Jewish people are no different. We have to realize from some perspective, regardless of religiosity or acts or different ways of life or culture, regardless of that, but just looking at the Jewish people as a whole, in terms of their relationship to society, there's a sum total of a major plus on the plus side. There's definitely a contribution that has been exponentially greater than our numbers by a long shot, whether it was medicine, science, discoveries, and so many factors. To the extent that if you look at history carefully, the person that wrote the maps for Columbus to cross the sea and to discover the new land was a disciple of Maimonides, who was a Jewish rabbi. The contribution has been measurable. There's a reason that this little landlocked country, almost, Israel, made up primarily of desert land that's been transformed to gardens of Eden. That little land is one of the most desired environments for the technological advances in the world. Every major country wants a piece of Israel. Whether it's the American military, whether it's Chinese technology, everybody wants a piece of that extraordinary creative capacity that the Jewish person brings to the table. And that has been the hallmark of Jewishness in terms of the contribution to the world, a complete, integrated, selfless contribution that continues to bear fruit. And the Jewish people have never said to the world, you know something, we're going to stop helping the world because the world wasn't around to help us when they killed a third of us. We never do that because the Jewish person is obligated to his mission. So what does it mean to be a Jew? Do you have to do certain things to be a Jew? Or can you just announce yourself as being a Jew? What does it mean to be a Jew? How do you practice Jewishness, being a Jew, which is so fundamental to the continuity of Jewishness as a nation, as a people, as a force of contribution, as a creative power. How do you sustain that being a Jew? What qualifies one in that direction? So it came to a question that happened in a practical way in conversation that I had with some people in the Jewish leadership position. We were having a conversation and they asked me, can you tell us why do the kids, and how do we get our Jewish kids in college to love Israel? How do we get the Jewish kids to love Israel? So many of the Jewish kids that we know, that we work with around the world, and college level kids, they either are neutral or they're anti the Israel, and they will even go to radical positions about how Israel behaves. So why is that? Why don't they love Israel? So I asked him again, and you're talking about a person who has, you might say, non-traditional perspectives. These perspectives are, you might say, in the political line, is extremely liberal left-wing thinking pattern. So he wants to understand that from a human point of view. So I asked him very simply, why should they love Israel? He said, why should they love Israel? What do you mean why they should love Israel? He says to me. I mean, they're Jewish, aren't they? They want to love Israel. Really? They're Jewish? Do they like being Jewish? Is that important in their lives? Being Jewish? Why should they love Israel? What do you mean, why should they love Israel? Because Israel was given as a Jewish land. I said, why? Because in 1948, the world was so guilty enough because they just saw the slaughter of a third of our people for no reason, men, women, and children. So they felt guilty enough to give you a land, to give you a piece of land in Israel before 1948. So maybe the Palestinians have a point from that point of view, because they were there before 1948. They got to pay for your guilt? Wait a second, he says. But it's in the Bible. Oh, really? Bible? What is that? You think the Bible's important? Which page is important? Which page is not important? Which is not important, but Israel, come on, do me a favor. You're being knocked out of any courtroom in the country. You come with a document, you say, well, I want to just pick one line in this document. Everything else is a bunch of baloney. You can't get them to love Israel until they start loving being Jewish. Who are they? They don't even know. It's not their fault. These are beautiful, wonderful, brilliant, powerful, leadership level young people that have no information, but one of the most vital things in their existence, the one thing in their life that their life is on the target for, the one thing you can get killed for in this world with these crazies, for being a Jew. Because all these people that don't understand why they're Jewish, they're still scared of anti-Semitism. Why? Because they can't get that identity out of their system, but they don't have any benefits from it. It's you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't eat this restaurant, you can't eat in that restaurant. Come on, enough with these limits, enough with the rules. Why create rules? No more, no rules, of course. And that fits very well with a new thinking pattern that you create your own rules and you create your own space. But that's why, interestingly enough, I just happened to read this article that addressed the state of mind of young people today in our generation on every level, in their emotional side, in their practical side, in their intimate side, in how they interact with each other physically. And the statement is, after a thorough study program published, you could read it yourself. It was published as an excerpt in the New York Times last week, 2 weeks ago. But I'm sure there's a lot of information about this matter. The most unhappy period of them measuring statistics at that age level. Unhappy in their physical interactions. You would think, you know, the whole world became a big spring break in college. You know, spring break is officially spring break, but then you have the unofficial spring break, and you should be the most happy on period. There's no feelings. There's no intimacy. There's no closeness. There's no identity. You don't even remember the person's name. It's just an animal instinctive response to just body aspects. That's what it turns out to. So what do you expect when you take this powerful aspect of Jewishness and we don't even know how to experience it? How do you experience Jewishness? By being afraid of anti-Semitism? It's very interesting that you'll probably find guys who look most Jewish, like my colleagues, my fellow shluchim, who you can't mistake that they're Jewish wherever they are, even if they're not praying in the middle of the airport, but just their way they dress and they walk. And they're in some little towns when I've been to in the 1960s, when we went to the Berkshire, we were like traffic stoppers, literally, walking down the street. And none of us are afraid of anti-Semitism. That's been a historical thing. There's been a bunch of haters out there because Jewishness, the lifestyle, the meaningfulness of it, the concept of it, the freedom of it, that connection that is so deep that it touches the core of your existence, that you can never get rid of it. If you practice it properly, it is such an extraordinary, pleasurable, workable, powerful system. We never get to see it or understand it. And that's what happened on Pesach. Pesach, we transformed. We were the only people in the universe that transformed from a family to a nation. We were not a hodgepodge of different nations that came together and lived on borders of each other and decided that we have to have some kind of an amalgamation so that we can protect each other and have certain common laws and stuff, and things of that nature. We were really members of a family that then became so extraordinary that this family became a nation. And we still identify as a family because we don't talk about we are the children of Moses. We talk about the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We don't talk about them as our teachers and our mentors. We talk about their fathers and our mothers. It's a whole different experience. And we can actually access that because people are hungry for it. There is a trajectory of movement to spirituality today. Passover gives us an opportunity because we have extraordinary props, you might say, concepts that we can identify with the matzah, the wine, the maror. You can actually participate in some physical way of interacting with some aspects and translating them into lifestyle, to how it fits into a world. So as we come to this time of the year, Pesach, it's really a time that we can break out and become really free and unencumbered by society's influences and so forth. In the freest of societies, we are afraid of being canceled or being whitewashed or otherwise. Nobody owns us. Hashem gives us the opportunity to do whatever we want, to be absolutely internally connected. So that's what Jewishness is really all about. And it translates itself in the act of Jewishness. And just to leave you with one last thought as you move into this opportunity for real freedom, what's the most powerful thing you can do for freedom? It's not to think free, it's not to feel free, it's to do free. The last findings of the most advanced thinking patterns in neurology and doing also in genetics is the field of epigenetics. Because you cannot control, you cannot change your genes, but you can control your genes. You can express certain genes, suppress certain genes. How do you express or suppress genetics? It's called the epigene. The epigene is an impossible, you can't measure it. It's like the Higgs boson, like the God particle. We know it exists because of the activity around it, but we do not have the instrumentation to measure it. Same with this epigene. The epigene attaches itself to genetic and controls it. What causes this epigene? So they now have a control study. What causes the epigenome that controls the genetic system, that changes the whole personality, is not what you think, it's not what you feel, it's what you do. Action, behavior is the single most powerful force of human development, not thought and emotion. You can think right and feel right and do wrong, and you're zero. And you can think wrong and feel wrong and do right, and you're 100%. You may not feel so good, but that's a different issue. You want to internalize. It's a whole different process. But it's right in our hands. We are at a tipping point in our society today. So you should have a happy kosher Pesach. Hit that high note of freedom in honor of the Rebbe's 120th birthday, and the whole world has kind of woken up to his impact, and we can make it happen.
Thank you. Those words were mesmerizing. Very, very powerful. I really want to thank you for that message. It was thought-provoking, fundamental, and practical. Thank you, Rabbi Lipskar. So I have some fantastic questions that came in. So we'll start with one that came in for Rabbi Greenberg. Just to mix it up here a little bit. Okay. So talking about the Kremenchuk, the other side of town, the negative side of town, this person asked, if my friend lives in the other Kremenchuk, the negative side of town, how do I talk to them and how do I live with them? Go for it, Rabbi, but unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself, Rabbi Greenberg. We don't hear you.
Look, can you?
Yeah, now I hear you.
Look, obviously, I don't know the specific person and situation, so I can't really answer fully at all. But generally, I mean, it makes a big difference if we're talking about a friend, a child, a spouse. These are all different kinds of responses, but generally, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to change somebody else. It's very difficult. Who was it? I think Woody Allen one time said, he said, people accuse me of being a self-hating Jew. He says, it's true, I hate myself, but it's not because I'm Jewish. Now, people are difficult. We each have struggles, challenges. We all know it's hard enough to change ourselves. So you're asking, how do you change somebody else? So generally, we don't have control of other people. But if you want to say, what is the most powerful thing we could do? And that is that we should be that living example of positivity, of viewing things in a positive way. And sometimes the way we behave is contagious, especially with children. So that would be, I would say, one very important thing. Obviously, sometimes a person, it's necessary for, it can be a friend or something that struggles with this issue and they're negative and they have very negative. Sometimes it's most effective if it's not us, depends what the relationship is that's speaking to them. It could be a friend that would be more helpful in having a discussion with them. Sometimes it could be, very often it's a spiritual thing, a psychological thing, but sometimes it could also be a genetic thing. There are times people have certain conditions where they simply need, a certain kind of medicine or a pill. It could be a chemical thing. What's interesting is this, and I'm going to conclude with this, just a practical thing. If it's a chemical issue, if somebody's sad or depressed or whatever, because of a chemical issue, then it's not a spiritual thing. And no spiritual antidote's going to help. It needs to be addressed in that way. And then the reverse, of course, is true. If a person is negative and unhappy because of a spiritual thing, because they're lacking spiritual content in their life, could be a mitzvah, it could be their sense of that they have a purpose and they're connected with God, then they can have all the vitamins in the world. Just like you can have, if somebody has an iron deficiency, you can do all the exercise in the world, you can eat all the food in the world. If that is not addressed, you're not going to be healthy, you're going to have that problem. But what people don't realize is that also applies spiritually. You can have perfect comfort and physical health and great environment, but if there's a soul deficiency, just like a deficiency in iron, that needs to be addressed. So those are some general key points with the understanding that it's not, we can do we have an influence over ourselves in the strongest way. When it comes to other people, our influence is much more by example, by inspiration, but there's a limit to what we can do.
Thank you. Rabbi Lipskar, do you want to add anything to that, or should we go to the next question?
Response.
So this question is directed towards Rabbi Lipskar. How do I enter the Pesach Seder with the mindset that you described? It just seems ironic that of all times of the year, Pesach is always the one that's most stressful, filled with family drama, and I'm a bundle of nerves by the time the Seder comes.
That's a very good question. And it's almost, the most sophisticated and difficult questions are the simplest ones and have the simplest responses. The reason you come into the Seder with that attitude, that mindset, because you just didn't get out of prison. You're still in that same prison. You're still in that same jail. At the Seder, you're supposed to get out of prison. So it'd be a good example of what it means to say, take a deep breath and say, thank you, Hashem, I'm here. It's over. No more. We're having a good time now. We're going to party. We're going to have 4 cups of wine. We're going to get together and really feel what it means to be a Jew in the most extraordinary way. And especially we live in a free country that we can sit at our Seder tables open. My grandparents couldn't do that in Russia, as your grandparents probably could not do that, and so forth. So it just depends on the mindset you enter. First of all, you have to have a consciousness. Whatever I'm talking about earlier requires, the Alter Rebbe Tanya did not write this book of Tanya for the sophisticated few that had these esoteric thoughts in their mind. He wrote it for you and me and everybody else that lives a regular, practical life. And one of the most important aspects of Tanya is consciousness. That whatever you do, you have to be there. You have to be there in your space, which means if you enter into the Seder, you have to take off your apron that you were cleaning the kitchen with and get into a different space. It requires that. Most people don't do that. It's just a natural flow of time, and they don't take a stop and say, "Now I'm going into." There's a reason that you light your candles, you make Kiddush. I mean, there's a break. There's an absolute break that's necessary, and what it takes, it's very simple. It's a consciousness, because you can get into that spirit very, very quickly. And children have especially very. You know how long it takes for an adult to go from a breakdown, crying, fit, angry, etc., to being absolutely equal and normal. Sometimes it takes a lifetime, but it definitely takes a little time. You know how long it takes for a kid? 5 minutes. He's screaming, and the guy's going crazy. You give him what he wanted, the toy or the apple or the candy. Done. He's laughing. Why is that? He doesn't come with baggage. But the adult, it's not this little thing that happens. Now, this little thing, big as a whole trauma, the whole trauma of life comes together all of a sudden. Don't do that. I mean, who's asking you to become a psychologist to yourself all of a sudden, every minute of the day? What you have to do, the Rebbe always stressed the fact that even though there's importance to the past, everything's built in the past, there's importance to the future, we live in the moment. You don't live with the past, you don't live with the future, you live with what's today, right now. So that's a practicality of a thought process that is necessary, very necessary as you go into Pesach. I mean, it's the same thing, most people, when it comes to Friday Shabbos, they come into Shabbos, they're exhausted. Well, Friday night, you understand exhausted, even Shabbos, it's the one prayer in the Siddur, really in the Siddur is one prayer where the particular part of the prayer that generally said publicly, Baruch Hu, there is a short prayer Friday night where you can say it at home on your own. It's not any other time, because Friday night kind of, I guess at some point there was some people did not always go to shul Friday night, whatever the case might be. But it comes to Shabbos night, it's invariably, and people don't do it on purpose. If Shabbos is now at 6:41 or 8:41, at 8:40 they're already looking at the clock. At 8:41 you have to start the evening service or make Havdalah because Shabbos is over and we got a lot to do. My thought process, when the end of Shabbos comes, I wouldn't mind if Shabbos hung out for another hour or two. I could use that space, nice peacefulness. What is that? It's just better of what we're used to, how we deal with it. But it can be easily rectified. In any case, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity before Pesach, especially in the month of Nisan. And Rebbe's honor that all of these things are happening, because if not for the Rebbe's instruction and viewing us with that spirit, definitely none of us would be on the field doing what we're doing.
Thank you. I think we have 2 more questions here, or 3. This is an interesting one. It's more general about our topic today. How are Purim and Pesach the same, and how are they different? Are there any similarities between the villains of Purim and Pesach and the heroines and heroes of Purim and Pesach? And our relationship to Hashem, how does this help us and guide us, this Purim Pesach comparison? Either one of you.
Just practically, Purim, we don't say Hallel because we were still not under Jewish jurisdiction. We still lived under the general jurisdiction of nations. The temple had not yet been reinitiated in a meaningful way, rebuilt in any way. It was going to be rebuilt. It was really not a period of total freedom. It was a period of, at that time, what happened was that Achashverosh became like America in a certain way. It was very open to our religious system, and Jewishness made an impression of a lot of general society became Jews. Since many of the nations of the nation of the lands decided to embrace Judaism, and it was really a moment of grace, you might say, of saving of our bodies, but a moment of awakening as well. So it was a Jewish awakening. It was very powerful. An awareness of being Jewish because they realized that their lives were on the line and they were just saved by a supernatural reality and so forth. But they were not yet free. The temple was not built. They still lived in a secular kind of a space where the educational system was not yet perfected in any way as it was in Babylon or later on in Israel. But nonetheless, Passover represents our becoming a nation. It's a whole different experience. Even though Purim was a very powerful time, it was a time where the entire nation of Israel put their life on the line just for God, for no other reason. They would have chosen to give up their Jewishness, they would have been saved. They chose not to, men, women, and children. So that's a very powerful factor. That's why our connection to the Torah is more evident and strengthened by Purim. But Passover is a time when we became that independent nation from family. Instead of just being the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, we became Am Yisrael, we became the nation, Tivas Hashem, the army of God, so to speak. A different kind of experience, which more dynamic experience in terms of our identity. In any case, I hope you don't mind if I have to go off a few minutes early, because I do have a 4 o'clock meeting that I need to attend.
Rabbi Lipskar, thank you so much for joining us and for your unbelievable words. Thank you. Have a beautiful Pesach.
And same to you, please.
Happy and healthy.
Rabbi.
Rabbi Greenberg, can you stay on for another few minutes?
I'll just add to what Rabbi Lipskar said. The question was also about the difference between the leaders. If you look at Passover, Moses versus who was the hero, one of the main heroes of Passover, and you look at Esther and Mordechai of Purim, we often don't realize it. Mordechai, look at actually Moses first. Look at Moses. Moses was almost like, I don't mean to be irreverent, but he was like almost a FedEx worker of God. God told him exactly what to do, what to deliver, how to deliver it, where to go. He even told him what Pharaoh's going to do. He's going to say, you go here, deliver this message. Pharaoh's going to say this. Come back. We're going to work it out. Go here, stand here by the sea. So when you look at the story of Passover, Moses was communicating with God, and God told him exactly what to do throughout. When you look at the story of Purim, Mordechai and Esther were in the dark. God didn't come to Esther and say, Esther, here's the strategy. God didn't come to Mordechai, this is the strategy you're going to win. No, not a word. It was quiet. Crickets. So Esther had to come up with the strategy herself. No guarantee it would work. She has a whole elaborate strategy, but it was her own thinking, her own initiative. So in many ways, the story of Purim is much more, we can relate to it much more because we're much more like that. We're living at a time where most of us, I'm sure there's some exceptions here, maybe the Rabbis, and God doesn't talk to us on a regular basis in burning bushes. We don't see God coming and saying, this is what you do, it's going to be good. We're saying, how do I make a difference? How do I bring redemption to this one person? How do I create a bit more of charka? How do I do something good? You say, 1 second, I'm not sure. How do I know it's going to be successful? What Purim reminds us is, and that came later in Jewish history, there's a time in Jewish history when we needed the big miracles, 100%. But more sophisticated as we move into Jewish history is that a Jew needs to know that you take the initiative, you make the strategy, do what you think, and God's going to be there. God's going to help you. But don't say, I can't do it. And that's very powerful. Esther had no training. She didn't go to some diplomatic course to learn how to deal with Haman, powerful dictator in Ahasuerus. She was one woman, untrained, vulnerable, alone amongst difficult, sophisticated tyrants. And you look at her background, she even hid her Jewishness. So imagine that. So somebody could say, Esther, she's barely Jewish herself. She's a hidden Jew. She's going to save the Jewish people. So what Purim reminds us is, don't say, I can't. Don't say, not me. Don't say, I don't have a strategy. Don't say, God didn't tell me. What Purim reminds us is, there's a moment, there's an opportunity, there's something you can do. Maximize what you could do, and then watch God step in. There's going to be miracles. And that brings us to Passover. Passover has this incredible element to it, where Pharaoh's daughter is walking on next to the Nile, happens to be one day, and she hears a child crying in the basket, and she realizes this is a Jewish kid. She realizes this is her father's genocide. Imagine that. She probably heard rumors, but she didn't have Instagram, so she didn't know fully. But anyways, now she sees her father's genocide. There is a Jewish child. So what is she going to do? Her father says, kill Jewish boys. She can't save this Jewish kid. Plus, the Talmud says the basket was far out. She couldn't even reach it. But in the Talmud, it says she extended her arm. She extended her arm. A miracle happened. It said God extended her reach, and she rescues Moses. Tishlach et amata. The Talmud says her hand went much longer than it could have. But when we stop, the Talmud is telling us something very powerful, very relevant to get to the heart of your question. Pharaoh's daughter is walking on the Nile. She hears a child cry, meaning a human being is walking through their day and they see another person in pain. They hear the cry of another human being. Somebody else needs their help. And they feel it, and they feel compassion for the person. But then they're realistic, they're mature, they're sophisticated. They say, I don't have the capacity, the environment, the space, the resources to make a difference. The child, the cry is beyond my reach. How can I can't even, I would love to rescue, but I have to be realistic. I can't do anything. So because I'm very realistic, let me just watch another movie. Yeah, not something else on Netflix. Why? Because what can I do? Pharaoh's daughter knew, in God's world, if I hear a child cry, I extend my arm. I maximize the capacity God gave me as far as it could go. And only because she extended her arm, God extended its reach. And she raised one of the greatest human beings on the face of the earth that changed all of human history, according to most of half of humanity. More says Moses, holy, powerful, prophet, 10 commandments. So what's the story? The story is like Basia, the Pharaoh's daughter, like Mordechai and Esther, we all have limited capacity. But if we hear that somebody needs our help, what we're reminded to do is take the initiative, extend your arm as far as it can go. And then miracles happen. Then seas split, children are raised, the world changes. So we got to maximize what we can do, and then we have redemption.
Beautiful. What a beautiful way to end our program, Rabbi. So I want to thank you really very, very much, and Rabbi Lipskar, and Rabbi Wilhelm, Chabad of Portland, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. Thank you for this beautiful program. I just want to let you know the program was recorded, and there will be a link available to all registered attendees. Look out for the next LightTalks happening later this summer. Thank you all for joining us. Have a beautiful, inspiring Pesach.
you. Happy Pesach.